She was already crying by the time she reached his table, and she was trying very hard not to let anybody see it. Josie Calloway, 29 years old, hair pinned up fast in the dark, an apron washed so many times the color had given up. She pressed a napkin to her cheek and turned her face toward the window, toward the snow coming down over the pines outside, and she held the coffee pot in both hands, because that was the only way to hide what the left one was doing. Rocco Vitale looked up at her from the booth and didn't say anything yet. 34 years old, black wool coat he hadn't bothered to take off, a face that didn't give anything away for free. Back in Providence, men crossed the street when they saw that face. Out here in a Vermont diner in the middle of a February storm, he was just a stranger with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He'd taken the seat facing the door, the way he always did, and he'd been sitting there long enough to know things about her that she'd never told a living soul. He'd seen the way she never turned her back on the kitchen. He'd seen her smile at every single customer, and every single time that smile stopped somewhere below her eyes and never made it the rest of the way up. He knew that smile. He'd spent his whole childhood watching it on his own mother's face. Behind them, 17 people were eating dinner, and not one of them was looking up. They'd all learned not to. Outside, 3 black SUVs sat parked facing the highway, and then Rocco Vitale set his cup down very carefully, because his hand had started to want to do something his head hadn't approved yet, and he asked her the question that nobody in that room had asked her in 2 years. If stories about ordinary people finding their courage mean something to you, hit that like button and share this with someone who needs it tonight. Subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. Now let's go back to that diner, 20 minutes before she started crying. The bell above the door of the Blue Spruce gave a dry little ring at 10:10, and the first person to look up wasn't a customer, but Ruth Ann Doyle. She had been standing behind the counter of this diner since Mrs. Addie was still alive, long enough to know who had walked through the door just from the sound of their shoes, and tonight those footsteps sounded like no one who had ever stopped near exit number 12 in the middle of February. She looked out at the parking lot before she looked at the man's face. 3 black cars were parked in a row, and all 3 were facing the highway. Ruthie had lived long enough in a small town to understand that ordinary people parked whichever way was convenient, while people who parked facing the road were people who always planned their way out before they went in. She said nothing. She only put down the dish towel. The first man through the door wore a black wool coat and didn't take it off. The second came in behind him, older, with closely cut salt and pepper hair, and he didn't follow the first man to the table. He stopped beside the door and stayed there, arms resting at his sides, his eyes moving once around the room in the way a person counts how many people are present rather than looks for somewhere to sit. Then he became still as a post. He didn't sit down once all evening, and no one in the diner dared ask why. The man in the black wool coat walked straight to the table beside the window, sat down, then immediately stood and moved to the opposite side. Ruthie saw all of it. She didn't understand why he changed seats, but she knew with certainty that he hadn't moved because the other side was warmer. She passed Josie, who was straightening a stack of menus at the end of the counter, and said quietly, almost without making a sound, that tonight she shouldn't pay too much attention to the table by the window. Just pour the coffee and leave it at that. Josie looked up. Ruthie added that some people walked into a diner not because they wanted to eat, and there was no need for them to know what those people had come for, only not to look too long. Josie nodded. She picked up the coffee pot and walked over. The man didn't look at the menu. He only said black coffee, and he said it in the voice of someone accustomed to saying something once and expecting that to be enough. Josie poured it. He thanked her, and she hesitated for half a beat because it had been a very long time since anyone in that diner had thanked her for a cup of coffee. She turned away. He didn't order anything else for the next hour. Outside, the snow thickened over the parking lot and turned the row of pines along the road white. Inside the diner, 17 people sat eating dinner, and there was something strange that only someone newly arrived would have noticed. In any diner at this hour, there should have been voices calling for a server, somebody laughing too loudly, somebody asking for more sauce. Not here. Knives and forks touched plates softly, as though the entire room had made an agreement long ago without ever speaking it aloud. When someone wanted more coffee, they didn't call out. They lifted the cup about the width of a finger joint and set it back down, and Josie understood, and Josie came over. Chet Lundgren sat on his usual stool at the counter, the same stool he had used since the days when he still delivered mail, and he ate more slowly than usual because of the snow outside, and because there was no one waiting for him at home. In the farthest corner, A woman sat alone with a notebook and a glass of water, and she had been there before the black cars ever pulled into the lot. No one paid any attention to her. In the kitchen, Benny Salas worked a skillet and didn't sing the way he usually did. Rocco Vitale sat quietly at the table beside the window and watched. He didn't watch like a man searching for gossip. He watched like a man who had spent his entire life walking into unfamiliar rooms and needing to know within 30 seconds who held the power, who was afraid, and who was about to do something foolish. In Providence, that habit had kept him alive. Here, it only made him notice something he might have missed if he had been a little more tired, or if the coffee had been a little hotter, or if the road outside hadn't been blocked by snow. This room wasn't quiet. This room was holding its breath, and he had been inside enough rooms holding their breath to know there was always a reason. And that reason usually wasn't sitting out in the dining room. It was somewhere behind it, beyond the kitchen door, where the customers couldn't see. He lifted his coffee, took a sip, and sat waiting for that reason to come out. Chet Lundgren finished his plate, pushed it away a little, then did the thing he had been doing for the past several winters. He took out his wallet beneath the edge of the counter, pulled out a bill, folded it into quarters until it was very small, and when Josie passed by to refill his coffee, he caught her wrist for 1 second and pressed the folded bill into her palm. He didn't speak loudly. He spoke just loud enough for the two of them to hear, telling her that this was hers, that she shouldn't put it in the jar out front, that she should keep it and use it for whatever she needed. Josie closed her hand around it. She thanked Uncle Chet in the voice of someone who was genuinely grateful, while at the same time calculating very quickly where she could hide it. Chet watched her hand, then added one more sentence. And he said it the way older people often say things, simply letting the words fall out without thinking about whose ears they might reach. He said there was something strange about this girl, that she had been pouring coffee with both hands ever since last winter. He had asked her once. She told him it was because her hands were cold. Ruth Ann Doyle was wiping the counter a few steps away, and she didn't look up, but the cloth in her hand stopped moving. At the table beside the window, Rocco Vitale didn't look up either. He only turned his cup on the saucer exactly 1/4 of a turn. Then the kitchen door opened. Grant Mercer stepped into the dining room with a towel still in his hand, wiping his hands as he walked with the unhurried rhythm of a man who had nothing in the world to rush for. He was around 40, his hair neatly combed, his shirt buttoned at the cuffs, and he had the pleasant manner of a manager every customer would describe as kind. He nodded to table number 3. He asked Chet whether the snow outside was making his knees ache. He smiled. That smile traveled across the entire room without making anyone uncomfortable. Then he called Josie's name. He called it softly, so softly that the sound almost didn't travel across the whole room, and anyone sitting at the farthest table probably wouldn't have heard it at all. But Josie heard. Rocco watched her, and he saw something he would remember for a very long time afterward. She didn't flinch. She didn't spin around. She did something far worse. She became smaller. Her shoulders dropped, her chin lowered slightly, her whole body folding inward like a sheet of paper being folded over itself, and all of it happened within the space of a single breath, neat, practiced, like a movement repeated so many times that her body performed it without asking permission anymore. She turned and walked toward him. Mercer didn't shout. Mercer didn't threaten her. Mercer only stood there, folded the towel neatly into a square, draped it over his shoulder, then held out one hand with the palm facing upward and smiled at her. He didn't say a single word. He didn't need to. The entire room lowered its eyes to their plates at the same time. Chet Lundgren looked down at his empty plate and didn't dare look up. Benny Salas leaned his head through the kitchen opening, then pulled it back. Ruthie stood still with the cloth in her hand. No one said anything. No one did anything. All 17 people sat there, and every one of them knew exactly what was about to happen because they had seen it more times than they could count, and they had learned that looking down was easier. Josie reached into the pocket of her apron. She took out the bill, folded into quarters. For one very brief moment, her fingers tightened around it, and Rocco saw that tightening. Then she opened her hand and placed the small folded bill into Mercer's palm. Mercer took it. He didn't count it. He didn't look down. He simply slipped it into his trouser pocket with a motion so familiar it had become smooth, then lifted one hand and patted her shoulder twice. Gently, almost affectionately, the way someone might pat a child who had just finished an assignment. He told her, "Good girl." He said, "See? That wasn't so hard, was it?" Then he turned away. stopped at table number 3 to ask the 2 customers whether the soup tasted good tonight, smiled once more, and disappeared behind the kitchen door. Josie remained where she was for about 2 seconds. Then she kept moving, coffee pot in hand, went to refill table number 5, and did all of it with a completely ordinary expression on her face. At the table beside the window, Rocco Vitali set his coffee cup down. He placed it there very slowly, very carefully, both hands resting flat on the table, because his hands had just begun to want to do something his mind hadn't yet given them permission to do. About 10 minutes later, Rocco stood up and walked toward the back of the diner. He didn't really have anything to do there. He only wanted to pass through the narrow hallway leading toward the rear, where there was a staff room door and a wooden board with several work schedules hanging from it, their edges curled with age. Gio watched him from his place beside the entrance and didn't move. The hallway was darker than the dining room, and the staff room door was left slightly ajar, leaving a thin strip of yellow light stretching across the floor. Rocco was about to walk past it. Then he heard it. It wasn't crying in the way people usually understood crying. There were no sobs, no gasping breaths, nothing a person passing by could easily put a name to. There was only a very small, broken sound, something being crushed somewhere deep in the throat before it ever had the chance to become whole. The sound of someone who had practiced for a very long time and become very good at crying without letting a single sound escape. He stopped. He didn't push the door open. He only stood there in the dim hallway, and he thought of something he hadn't thought about in many years. A small kitchen in South Providence, and a woman standing with her back turned at the sink, her shoulders trembling almost imperceptibly, while a little boy sat at the table unable to understand why his mother kept standing there and wouldn't turn around. Then the crying inside the room stopped. Another sound took its place, coins dropping onto a metal tabletop, 1 coin at a time. Not a handful poured out all at once, but each one set down separately, clink, clink, slowly and steadily, with a very brief silence between each sound, brief enough to understand that someone in there was counting. Rocco stood and listened until it was over. He didn't know how much she was counting, and he didn't know what she was counting it for, but he'd lived long enough to understand that people only counted coins one by one when the final number truly decided something. The counting stopped. Water ran for a few seconds. Rocco turned around, went back into the dining room, and sat down in his old place before that door opened. He didn't say anything to Gio. When Josie came back out, she'd already wiped her face. She'd smoothed her hair, straightened her apron, and picked up the coffee pot to make another round through the tables exactly as she did every night. There were only 2 things she couldn't hide. Her eyes were red, and that redness was the kind cold water couldn't wash away. She came to the table by the window last. She tilted the coffee pot toward his cup and smiled at him, the smile she'd been wearing on her face all evening, the smile that stopped somewhere beneath her eyes and never traveled the rest of the way up to them. And Rocco spoke his first real words to her that night. He told her she didn't have to do that. Not with me. Josie froze. The coffee pot tilted, then stopped halfway. She opened her mouth to say something. Probably the thing she always said to everyone, that she was fine, that it had only been a long shift. But the words never made it to her lips. Rocco watched them break apart right there on her face. And she cried. She cried right there beside his table, in the middle of the dining room, and she tried with everything she had to keep anyone from seeing. She quickly pulled a paper napkin from the table, pressed it to her cheek, turned her face toward the window, toward the snow falling thick and white over the row of pines outside, and held the coffee pot with both hands, because that was the only way to hide what her left hand was doing. Rocco didn't stand up. He didn't reach for her. He sat still and looked at her, and he let her have those few seconds entirely to herself. Then he set his coffee cup down and asked her. He asked who had made her cry. He asked very softly, and there wasn't a trace of anger in his voice, only a quiet certainty, the kind of certainty that belonged to a man who had already made his decision and was only waiting to hear the name. Josie shook her head. She said, "I can't." He said, "You can. Say it out loud. Say the name." Her lips moved twice, and nothing came out. Then she glanced very quickly toward the kitchen door, a glance so fast that she herself didn't even realize she'd made it, and she spoke. She said the manager. She said Mr. Mercer. She said 2 years. The coffee pot trembled in her hands. Chet Lundgren stopped chewing. At the end of the counter, the cloth slipped from Ruth Ann Doyle's hand and fell to the floor. No one picked it up. The entire room, All 17 people who had spent 2 winters learning how to lower their eyes to their plates looked up at the same time. Rocco lifted one hand and pointed to the chair across from him. Josie shook her head and said she couldn't sit down, that if he came out and saw her sitting there, then he told her to sit. What he sees is for me to worry about. And there was something in the way he said it. Not loudly, not as a promise, only with the flat certainty of a man who had already made up his mind, that made her set the coffee pot on the edge of the table and sit on the very edge of the chair, the way someone sat when she expected to have to jump up at any moment. He asked when it had started. She said after Addie died and he came here. She said he'd been very kind at first, and that was the part nobody ever wanted to believe. Rocco said, "I believe you." She looked up at him. He said it again, more slowly this time. "I believe you. Keep going." So she did. She told him about the work schedule, how he always changed her shifts at the last minute, changed them after the schedule had already been posted, changed them after she'd already asked someone to cover for her, changed them so often that she couldn't make a plan with anyone in her life more than 3 days ahead. She said she'd missed appointment after appointment, and every time he apologized very politely, and every time he said it was because of the supplier, because of the weather, because somebody else had called out, never once because of him. She told him about her wages. He'd never cheated her out of a single dollar. He only paid her late. 1 day late, sometimes 2, and there was always a perfectly reasonable explanation, and it had taken her a long time to understand that the delay wasn't an oversight. It was a reminder. Once every month, it reminded her that the money in her pocket arrived when he decided it would arrive. She told him about the tips. She said at first he'd put out the shared jar and said it was only fair, so the girls who worked the slow shifts would still get something. And Ruthie had objected once, and then never again. Then, little by little, what had started as fairness became him deciding what fairness meant. And fairness, a little more every night, gradually came to mean that most of the money ended up in his pocket. She said the worst part wasn't losing the money. The worst part was that every time he held out his hand, she had to place it there herself, with her own hand, because he'd never once taken anything from her by force. Then she went quiet for a while, and she told Rocco the thing Mercer said to her almost every day in that gentle voice of his. He asked her whether she really thought there was anywhere else in the world that would hire someone like her. She said, "I've heard that sentence so many times I can't even remember the first time he said it. I only remember one day when I was driving home, and I heard myself thinking those exact words inside my own head, in my own voice, and that was when I got scared." Rocco asked whether she had anyone to go home to. Josie looked down at her hands. She said she'd grown up in houses that didn't belong to her, and she'd learned very early how not to be a burden to anyone. She said there was nobody. If she lost this job, she'd lose the apartment too. And if she lost the apartment, there was nothing underneath her anymore to catch her. Just the ground. Then she looked up and asked him a question he hadn't expected. She asked, "Why are you asking me? You don't even know who I am. There are more than a dozen people in this diner every night, and every one of them has seen it. It's been 2 years and not one person has ever asked me that question. Why you?" Rocco was quiet for a long time. He turned the cup slowly on its saucer. Then he said his mother had worked the night shift. For years, she left before the sky went dark and came home when morning was almost breaking. He said she had a name, and the manager where she worked never used it. He called her other things. Names that didn't sound particularly cruel if someone happened to hear them once from the outside. But if you heard them often enough, they became something else. He said he'd been too young back then. He sat at the kitchen table. He watched his mother come home. He saw her face, and he knew something was wrong, but he didn't know what question he was supposed to ask. He didn't have that question inside his head. He said it took him many years to find it. Then he looked at her and said, "Now I do." The kitchen door opened again, and Grant Mercer stepped into a room that was nothing like the room he'd left behind. He knew it immediately. Men like him always knew immediately, because he'd spent his whole life surviving by reading rooms. 17 people were looking straight at him. His waitress was sitting at a customer's table, and that smile slid instantly back onto his face, exactly where it belonged, exactly as wide as it needed to be. The smile meant for customers, the smile polished over so many years that it had almost become real. He said, "Josie, sweetheart, table 7 needs clearing." Then he turned toward the table by the window and asked, "Sir, is there something I can help you with?" Rocco didn't stand up. He didn't need to. He said, "Mr. Mercer." That was all. He used the man's name. The name no stranger in that diner should have known. The name Josie had spoken aloud less than a moment earlier, and the smile on Mercer's face faltered for exactly one beat before he managed to put it back where it belonged. Rocco continued, his voice still as even as if he were asking what time the train left. He said, "I've been sitting here all night. You already know what I saw." Mercer looked at him. Then he gave a short laugh, the laugh of a man who had laughed his way safely out of hundreds of situations in his life. And he began to talk. He said, "Sir, I don't know what that girl has been telling you." He said, "Josie is a good girl, but she has an imagination. You know how some people are, put a little pressure on them and they start making things up. And she doesn't have any family to speak of, so she tends to cling to anyone willing to sit down and listen to her for half an hour." He said it in a voice full of pity, right there in the middle of the dining room, in front of 17 people, and in front of Josie herself. Josie lowered her head. Rocco was stirring his coffee. He made half a turn and stopped. He lifted the spoon from the cup, tapped it lightly against the rim to shake off the drops, and placed it on the saucer. The small sound of metal touching porcelain was almost nothing, but in that room it sounded as clear as a lock turning shut. Rocco looked up, and for one very brief moment, no more than a second, his face was no longer the face of a customer sitting by the window drinking cold coffee. Chet Lundgren, who had delivered mail across that county for more years than he could count, and thought he'd met every kind of man there was, later said that in that moment a chill ran up his spine, and he couldn't explain why. Rocco said, "You just said something about her. I'm giving you one chance to take it back." Then he spoke again, without raising his voice even slightly. He said, "Where I come from, nobody gets a second chance. You're getting one because she's standing right here, and I don't want her to have to see what kind of man I am." Nobody in the diner breathed. Gio Petrosino, who had been standing beside the door all evening, shifted his weight slightly from one foot to the other. Mercer opened his mouth. Then he closed it. He looked around the room for a face willing to meet his eyes, someone who would nod, someone who would laugh it off and say, "Come on." Grant was only joking. He searched the entire room. He couldn't find a single one, and in that silence, the cloth Ruth Ann Doyle had dropped earlier was still lying on the floor, and she didn't pick it up. She stepped out from behind the counter. She'd been standing behind that counter since Addie was alive, and tonight was the first time in all those years that she'd walked into the middle of the dining room without carrying anything in her hands. She said, "I believe her." Her voice trembled. She said, "I believe her, Mr. Grant, because you did exactly the same thing to me. 2 winters ago, you told me that at my age, nobody else would hire me, and that if I left, you'd put something in my record that would make sure I couldn't get another job anywhere in this county. And I believed you. I've believed you ever since." Then she did something no one in that room had expected, not even Rocco. She reached into the pocket of her apron and took out her phone. She said, "I have proof." The whole room turned toward her. She said, "I wrote everything down. I've been doing it for seasons. Every day you took money, who you took it from, how much you took. I wrote it all in a notebook at home, and every night before closing I took a picture of the jar before you came out, and another after you left. I have pictures. I have dates. I have enough." The hand holding her phone was shaking violently. She turned toward Josie, and her voice broke. She said, "Josie, I'm sorry. I've had proof all these seasons, and I was a coward. I kept thinking I'd wait until later. Wait until I found somewhere else. Wait until I was brave enough. But I'm this old now. Where was I supposed to go? I kept thinking all I had to do was hold on to it, keep it safe, and someday there would be a right time." She lifted a hand to her mouth. She said, "But you were standing right beside me every night, and I saw everything, and I didn't say a single word." Josie stood up from the chair and walked over to her. She didn't say anything. She only took the trembling woman's hand between both of hers. Then Chet Lundgren pushed back his chair and stood. He said, "I saw it too. I saw it all this time. I just kept telling myself it wasn't my business." Benny Salas came out of the kitchen, set the ladle down on the counter, and stood there. One person, then 2, then the entire room. People who had spent 2 winters learning how to lower their heads rose one after another. No one shouted. No one pointed a finger. They simply stood, and that was the most frightening thing of all. Grant Mercer looked at the room he had believed belonged to him. Then he turned his back, walked straight to the door, and stepped out into the snow. The door closed behind Grant Mercer, and the bell above it gave one lonely little clang, and for several seconds, nobody in the diner seemed to know what they were supposed to do next. Then Benny Salas picked up the ladle and went back into the kitchen, because there was a pot of soup on the stove, and when something inside a person wouldn't settle, the hands needed something to do. Ruth Ann Doyle dropped heavily onto one of the counter stools, and Josie sat down beside her, still holding her hand. Gio Petrosino left his place by the door for the first time all evening. He walked over to the table by the window, bent down, and spoke to Rocco in the Providence-tinted Italian the two of them used when they didn't want anyone else to understand. He said that man wasn't going to stay quiet. Men like that never stayed quiet. He'd sit in his car, he'd make calls. And by tomorrow morning, what happened tonight would become an entirely different story. Rocco looked through the window, where a pair of red taillights were crawling out of the parking lot and disappearing into the snow. Gio added that he could take care of it before morning, cleanly, and nobody would ever have to know. He didn't say it like a threat. He said it the way a repairman might offer to replace a leaking faucet. Rocco shook his head. He said no. Then he took out his phone and made a call. The person on the other end answered before the first ring had fully finished, and Rocco spoke in the voice of a man reading a menu to a waitress. He said, Grant Mercer, around 40 years old, give or take, Hollis Junction, Vermont, manager of a diner called the Blue Spruce, exit 12. I want to know who he owes money to. I want to know which bank holds the mortgage on his house. And I want to know who else is paying him besides Brannigan. He went quiet and listened for several seconds. Then he said before 6 o'clock in the morning. He ended the call. The whole thing hadn't lasted any longer than it took to make a cup of coffee. Gio stood there watching him. Then he asked, still in Italian, what the boss wanted him to do with Mercer. Rocco said nothing. Gio asked again, unable to hide his confusion, why he'd made that call if he didn't intend to do anything. Rocco turned his cup on the saucer and said, I don't want you touching him. I want you to learn him. That's much worse. Then he continued, slowly, as if he were explaining something very simple that people had a habit of forgetting. He said a man gets beaten. Then he wakes up the next morning with a story. He tells people he was attacked, and suddenly he's the victim, and everyone feels sorry for him, and nobody talks anymore about what he's been doing inside this diner for 2 winters. He said I'm not giving him that story. I want him sitting in his car tonight, understanding that somebody is reading his life the way they read a bill, and he doesn't know how far that person has gotten, and he won't be able to sleep, and he'll start doing stupid things all by himself. Gio nodded slowly. He'd followed this man for all those years, and he was still learning. Then Rocco looked up and added one more thing, and this time he said it in English, loudly enough for the people sitting nearby to hear, and he said it very clearly, one word at a time. He said, I'm not demanding anything from him. I'm not asking for money. I'm not telling him to quit his job. I'm not telling him what he has to do. I'm only asking questions. Gio looked at him for a moment, then understood, and he answered in English too, saying, yes, boss, you're only asking questions. At the end of the counter, Ruth Ann Doyle looked up at the 2 men, and she didn't understand everything that had just happened, but she understood one thing. She understood that the stranger at the window had just very carefully closed a door she hadn't even realized was open. Less than an hour later, a small truck came into the parking lot faster than was safe on a snow-covered road, and the diner door flew open so hard that the bell above it barely had time to make a proper sound. Walt Brannigan stepped inside, bringing with him a rush of cold air and a story he'd been hearing all the way from Rutland. He owned 3 diners in the county. He was past 60, and he carried himself like a man accustomed to having every room fall quiet when he entered it. His eyes swept the room and stopped at the table by the window. He said who he was. Rocco said, I'm the man drinking coffee. Brannigan said, don't play games with me. Grant called me 40 minutes ago. He said some guy from Providence brought men into my diner, threatened him in front of the customers, and forced him to quit. He said he was so afraid he couldn't stay. Then Brannigan turned toward Josie and pointed a finger at her. He said, and you. Grant told me everything. He said you've been stealing money from the tip jar for months, that he was getting ready to write you up, and that's the real reason for this little performance tonight. You found yourself a man who knows how to scare people, and then you made up a story to save your job. Josie stood at the end of the counter. Her face drained white. The entire room went quiet again. And in that silence, Chet Lundgren turned on his stool and spoke. He said, Mr. Walt. Brannigan turned toward him. Chet said I've been eating in this diner since I was still delivering mail. You know me. Tonight I gave that girl money. I put it in her hand myself, and I told her not to put it in the jar. Then Mr. Grant came out, held out his hand, and she had to put that money into his palm right in front of me. Chet said I was sitting about an arm's length away. If you want to know who was taking from whom, I just told you. Brannigan blinked. He opened his mouth to say something, but Josie stepped out from behind the counter. She walked into the middle of the dining room. Her hands were shaking, and everyone could see them shaking, but she stood there and spoke. She said, Mr. Brannigan, in the last 2 years, you've come into this diner 4 times. She said all 4 times, Mr. Mercer told me to go down to the storage room and check inventory. Every single time. Always on the exact day you came. Ask yourself one question. Why would a manager need to make sure that one waitress went 2 full years without speaking to her own employer even once? Brannigan didn't answer. Josie kept going, and her voice became steadier with every sentence. Not because she was less afraid, but because she'd already gone too far beyond the place where she could turn back. She said, you just called me a thief in the middle of the place where I work, in front of the people I serve every night. Fine, then look around this room. Everyone here tonight can stand up and go home, and tomorrow they'll still have their jobs, they'll still have their homes. You own 3 diners. You can walk out of here and nothing happens to you. I'm the only one who can't leave. She said, this diner is my rent. This diner is everything I have. If tonight you believe him instead of me, then tomorrow morning I have nothing left, and I know that. I know it very clearly while I'm standing here saying this to you. She said I'm the only person in this room who can't afford to walk away, and I'm still standing here telling you the truth. Then she said the last thing. She asked, does that sound like a thief to you? Or does it sound like someone who's been tired of being afraid for far too long? Walt Brannigan stood there with snow still clinging to his coat, and he looked at her, and something in the story he'd driven 40 miles believing no longer fit the room standing in front of him. He turned and looked around. He saw Ruthie. He saw Chet. He saw Benny standing in the kitchen opening. He saw a room full of people, and not one of them looked like someone who'd been frightened by a gangster into telling a lie. He didn't say anything else. He only stood there, and for the first time that evening, he looked like a man who wasn't sure anymore. Josie walked back to the table by the window and sat down. Now that no one was looking at her anymore, her hands finally began to shake for real. She put both hands on her thighs and pressed them down. She said very softly, almost as if she were only speaking to herself, I just told my boss he was wrong. Then she turned toward Rocco and asked, I'm going to lose my job now, aren't I? Rocco didn't get the chance to answer her before Benny Salas spoke from the kitchen opening. He said, Mr. Walt, come with me. Brannigan turned around. Benny said it again, and this time he set the ladle down on the counter altogether. He said, I clean this kitchen 6 days a week. Come into the storage room with me for a minute. The 2 men disappeared behind the door. The whole room sat still and listened to footsteps on the concrete floor, the sound of some kind of bin being dragged aside. Then a long stretch of silence. When they came back out, Benny walked first, and Brannigan followed behind him carrying an old tin cookie box in both hands, the kind of box nearly every household had once used for sewing thread or buttons. He set it on the counter. The box hit the wood with a heavy sound, the sound of something that wasn't empty. Benny said it was behind the flour bin in the corner, on the bottom shelf. He said, I've known it was there for a long time. He said every night after closing, he'd go in there for about a minute and then come back out. And I have eyes, and I kept thinking it was something between him and the owner. Something to do with the books. None of my business. His voice grew rough. He said, tonight I don't think that anymore. Brannigan looked at the box. On the lid were several words written in black marker, the letters slightly blurred from being handled so often, only his initials and the words, Retirement Fund. Brannigan read them. He read them twice. Then he popped the lid open and turned the box so the entire room could see inside. There was money in it, not a few loose bills, but rolls of cash bound with rubber bands, stacked on top of one another, packed tightly all the way to the rim, with smaller crumpled bills stuffed down into the gaps. It was the money from countless nights, countless seasons, countless hands that had placed it themselves into an open palm held out in front of them. Nobody in the diner said a word. Ruth Ann Doyle lifted a hand over her mouth. Josie stared at the box, and she didn't cry. She only stared, and there was a look on her face Rocco had seen before, on people who had just been shown proof of something they'd known for a very long time, but had never dared believe they were right about. Brannigan set the lid down on the counter. He stood there for a long time. A man past 60 in a coat, still wet with snow, and when he finally spoke, his voice sounded nothing like the voice he'd brought through the door. He said I need to tell all of you something, and I need to say it right now, because if I don't, I won't say it at all. He said a few seasons ago, a company came to me. They're in real estate. They wanted to buy this place, not the diner, but the land underneath it, because it sits right off the highway exit. They offered a lot. They offered more than this diner would make in years. He said I sat down with them. Twice. I came very close to putting my name on the paper. He stopped. Then he said I didn't sign, because before Adelaide Pruitt died, she made me promise her something about this place, and I gave her my word, and I'm not the kind of man who breaks a promise to the dead, so I backed out. I called them and told them it wasn't for sale. The room waited. Brannigan looked down at his hands resting on the counter. He said then, a few months later, when I needed a new manager for this place, somebody gave me a name. I got a call saying there was a fellow who'd spent years in restaurants, was looking for work, had a clean record, and that I should give him a call. He looked up and stared directly at Josie. He said that call came from the real estate company. Nobody breathed. He said I didn't think anything of it. I needed someone. Somebody recommended him. So I called. I interviewed him, and I hired him. He seemed pleasant. Customers liked him. The books were neat. He said, and then I drove back to Rutland, and I left him here with all of you. And over 2 winters I came in exactly 4 times. His voice broke in the middle of the sentence. He said I didn't take a single cent from you, Miss Calloway. All I did was open the door and let him walk through it. Then I drove home and slept well for 2 winters. He said I don't even know which is worse anymore. At the table by the window, Rocco Vitale said nothing. He only looked at the tin lid lying face up on the counter, and he began recalculating from the beginning everything he'd seen inside that diner all evening. In the farthest corner of the diner, the woman who had been sitting alone with a notebook and a glass of water closed the notebook. She had been there the entire evening, and not a single person had paid any attention to her. Not Ruthie, not Josie, not even Gio Petrosino, whose job was to notice everyone in every room Rocco Vitale ever entered. She stood up, made her way around the tables, and walked over to the counter where the tin box still sat open. Then she took a badge from her coat pocket and held it up. She said her name was Bernadette Kowalczyk, and she said she worked for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Gio stepped forward half a pace and stopped because Rocco had lifted one finger slightly from the tabletop. The entire room turned toward her. Brannigan took 1 step back from the box as if it had suddenly become hot. Rocco leaned back in his chair. He said, I see. He said, how long have you been following me? He didn't sound angry. He sounded like a man confirming the departure time of a train he'd already guessed. Kowalczyk looked at him, and then she did something he hadn't expected. She shook her head. She said, Mr. Vitale, I've been sitting in that corner since before you ever walked through the door. I ordered my food. I finished eating, and I was halfway through my 2nd glass of water when your cars pulled into the parking lot. She said, you're not the reason I'm here. She let those words sit in the middle of the room for a moment. Then she added, and that's the part you ought to find frightening. Rocco didn't answer. Kowalczyk turned toward Brannigan. She asked about the real estate company he'd just mentioned. Did he remember the name? Brannigan said, I remember the name, but it's only a name on paper. It doesn't mean anything. Kowalczyk said, yes, it doesn't mean anything. That's right. She opened her notebook, turned several pages, then said that name had been on her list for months. She said she hadn't come to Hollis Junction because of a cookie tin full of tip money. She said she'd come because along the highway corridor running through this county, 5 or 6 pieces of land beside the exits had changed hands over the past several seasons, and every time one of those properties refused to sell, 6 months later the business started going downhill. The employees began leaving, the owner grew exhausted, and eventually the property was sold anyway, only for far less money. She said nobody at those places had ever been threatened. Nobody had their windows smashed. Nobody was intimidated. It was simply that one day, a new manager would appear, and that manager would be very pleasant with the customers, and then everything would slowly begin rotting from the inside. She tapped one finger against the lid of the tin box. She said this, though, I didn't expect. This is a gift. Ruth Ann Doyle sat on the counter stool and said softly, almost to herself, so he was being paid to wear us down. Kowalczyk neither confirmed it nor denied it. She only turned back toward the table by the window. She said, Mr. Vitale, I know who you are, and I also know that tonight you haven't done anything that requires my attention. At least not in this room. But I'm going to ask you one question, and whether you answer it is entirely up to you. She asked, "Do you know who's behind that real estate company?" The room went silent. Rocco said nothing. He didn't move, didn't change his posture, didn't glance toward Gio, but something passed across his face, very quickly, no longer than a heartbeat, and it was gone before anyone could have put a name to it. Josie was sitting closest to him, and she was the only person who saw it. She had spent 2 winters learning how to read a man's face before he had the chance to say anything, and she knew exactly what she'd just seen. This man had just heard a name inside his own head, and it was a name he knew very well, and it was bad news. Rocco picked up his cold coffee, took a sip, and set it back down. He said, "I don't know." Kowalczyk watched him for another 2 seconds, then nodded and wrote 1 line in her notebook. She said, "All right," then closed the notebook, and everyone in the room understood that she hadn't believed a single word of it. Josie stood up. She rose so suddenly that the chair scraped backward across the floor, and everyone turned to look at her. She said Addie used to hide things. Ruth Ann Doyle looked up. Josie said she never kept important papers in the filing cabinet. Never. Because she said the filing cabinet was the first place anyone would search. She used to pull the bottom drawer out of the cabinet in the back room, tuck things into the empty space behind it, then slide the drawer back into place. Ruthie said, "Dear God, that's right. She kept her tax papers there too. I'd completely forgotten." Benny Salas was already gone. He went through the kitchen door, and the whole room heard him pull the drawer all the way out, then heard it lift free of its tracks. Then silence. A long silence. When Benny came back, he was walking more slowly than when he'd gone in, and in his hands was a craft paper envelope yellowed with the color of things that had spent too long in the dark. He placed it on the table in front of Josie. Nobody said anything. Across the front of the envelope were a few handwritten words in the slanted, trembling script of an old hand. The kind of handwriting people learned back when they were still taught how to make letters beautiful. It said, "For Josie, open when you're brave enough." Josie didn't reach for it. She stared at it, and Rocco saw her whole body draw back slightly, the same reflex he'd been watching all night, the reflex of someone who had learned that any piece of paper with her name on it inside this diner was bound to bring bad news. Ruthie said, "Open it, sweetheart." Josie said, "I'm scared." Rocco said, "Tonight you spoke his name in a room full of people, and you stood in front of your employer and told him he was wrong. He said, 'What is there in that envelope that could possibly frighten you more than that?'" Josie opened it. There were 3 things inside. The first was a handwritten letter, 2 pages long. She unfolded it and began to read, and after only a few lines, she lifted a hand over her mouth, and Ruthie had to take the paper from her and keep reading for her, and even Ruthie couldn't make it all the way to the end. Adelaide Pruitt had written in short sentences. Nothing fancy, the way old people wrote when they were writing as though they were sitting across the table talking to you. She wrote that she'd been watching Josie work there for years. She wrote that she'd hired more people in her lifetime than she could remember, and most of them were good people, but all they ever saw was the plate and the table. She wrote that Josie was different. You remember that Mr. Chet likes his coffee poured before he even has time to sit down. You remember that the old woman who comes in on Thursday afternoons isn't there because she's hungry. She's there because no one has asked her a single question all week. You remember everything. She wrote that you don't even know you're doing it, and that's the best part. Then she wrote the sentence Josie would later read more times than she could count. She wrote, "A girl who notices people that closely can run any place in this world." She wrote, "You only have to stop believing what people tell you, that you're not allowed to." She wrote that she'd meant to tell Josie all of this while she was still healthy. But old people had a habit of saving things for later, and when you saved things for later, sometimes you ran out of time. She apologized for that. The second thing in the envelope was a savings passbook. It had 2 names on it, Adelaide Pruitt's name, and beneath it, Josie Calloway's. Josie picked it up and then set it back down as though it couldn't possibly belong to her. She turned to the last page and looked at the number on the bottom line, and she didn't say anything. Benny leaned over her shoulder to look, then dropped heavily onto one of the counter stools. The third thing was a typed document with a notary seal stamped in the lower corner and Adelaide Pruitt's signature directly above it. Walt Brannigan picked up the paper and read it, and the color slowly drained from his face. He read it again. Then he spoke in the voice of a man who had just missed the final stare in the dark. He said, "This is an equity transfer document." He said Adelaide signed over 30% of the company that owns this diner to you. The entire room turned toward Josie Calloway, the same woman who only 2 hours earlier had stood there and placed a bill folded into quarters with her own hand into the open palm of a man waiting for her to surrender it. Brannigan kept reading farther down the page, and he began to slow, then stopped altogether. He said there was a condition. Kowalczyk stepped over and stood beside him. Brannigan said this document only becomes effective when the recipient signs the acknowledgement below. Adelaide's signature is already there. The notarization is there. The only thing missing is your signature. Then he said the part that seemed to drain the warmth out of the entire room. He said, and she put a deadline on it. He read it aloud. The recipient must sign before her 30th birthday. After that date, this document is no longer valid. Ruth Ann Doyle turned sharply toward Josie. She said, "Sweetheart, when is your birthday?" Josie sat very still. She said 11 days from now. No one spoke for a long while. Benny Salas stood up, then sat back down again. Kowalczyk picked up the document and examined the notary seal beneath the counter light, then said he couldn't destroy this. She said people think burning a piece of paper makes it disappear, but notaries keep records, and those records contain the date, the names, and the type of document. This exists, and it exists somewhere else besides this envelope. She set the paper down. She said so, he didn't destroy it. He did the only thing left to do. He hid it, and then he did the second thing. Rocco spoke for the first time since the envelope had been opened. He said hiding a piece of paper wasn't enough. A paper behind a drawer was something that could be found at any time. All it took was one person deciding to look. So he had to take care of something else. He had to make sure you never went looking. He looked at Josie. He said, "Think about it. A person who knows she's valued, who knows somebody once told her she was special, sooner or later is going to sit there one night and wonder why she's worked in the same place for so long and has never been promoted. And then she's going to ask questions, and then she's going to look." He said so for 2 winters. He had to make sure that thought never entered your mind even once. Ruthie lifted a hand to her mouth. She said that sentence, the thing he said to the girl every day. Rocco nodded. He said yes, that sentence. Then Brannigan said something else, and he said it very softly, as though he were confessing for the second time in one night. He said the bank letters. He said every savings account has statements mailed out, and if that account was in Adelaide's name, the mailing address would have almost certainly been this diner, because she registered everything here. He looked around the room. He asked who went out to the mailbox every morning. Benny said he did. He always got the mail himself. Every morning, said it was the manager's job. Josie sat staring at the savings passbook on the table in front of her. Then she did something no one understood. She lifted both hands to her face and let out a sound that almost sounded like a laugh. She said, "I count loose change." No one answered. She said, "I still count loose change in the back room. Every night. I pour it all onto the table and count every coin one at a time. Because every month I'm short. And every month I have to reach a certain amount before the 5th. And some nights I sit there counting it over and over because I don't trust myself to have counted it right." She lowered her hands. Her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying. She said that table is only a few steps from that cabinet. Rocco set down his coffee cup. He said, "Listen to me say this once, Josie, and then we're done with it." He said he didn't steal your tip money. That's the small thing. That can be counted. That can be taken back. He said what he stole from you was 2 years you should have been allowed to live knowing the truth about yourself. He said that's the part no one can ever give back to you. Kowalczyk said the most important thing now wasn't this document anymore. She said the most important thing was the notary's record book. Because this paper could be lost. It could burn. It could get wet. It could simply disappear inside a diner, where nobody had managed to keep anything properly safe for the past 2 winters. She asked whether the document showed the notary's name. Brannigan held the seal under the light and read a name aloud. Ruth Ann Doyle was holding a glass of water, and she set it down. She said, "I knew her." She said she worked in that little office beside the pharmacy on Main Street. She worked there for decades. Everybody in this town signed their papers with her. Then Ruthie stopped, and her voice sank. She said she died last year. The whole room went silent. Kowalczyk asked whether she had any children. Ruthie said yes, 1 daughter. Then she blinked, and she said the name. She said Nadine. Nadine Ostrowski. Benny Salas spun around. He said that girl worked here. He said she worked here one summer, before Josie came along. And then Mr. Grant let her go. Said she wasn't a good fit. Ruthie already had her phone out. She said, I have her number. Her mother and I went to the same church. She made the call, and the entire room sat listening to the ringing through the little speaker. Nadine answered after 4 rings, her voice sleepy and wary, the voice of someone working the night shift and receiving an unexpected call. Ruthie said, Sweetheart, it's Ruthie from the Blue Spruce. I only need to ask you one thing, and I know it's late, so forgive me. When your mother died, did you keep her notary record books? There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then Nadine said, I kept everything. She said Mom was very clear about it. She told me those books couldn't be thrown away. The law required them to be kept, and she said if anything ever happened to her, I had to make sure they were taken care of properly. She said I have them all in a plastic storage bin at the place I'm renting. Every one of them, not a single book missing, and I haven't even had the courage to open them once. Ruthie looked at Kowalczyk. Kowalczyk leaned toward the phone and said, Leave them exactly where they are. Don't touch them. Don't take them anywhere. I'll come to you in the morning. Nadine asked what's going on, and Kowalczyk said the sentence that made the entire room understand at the same time. She said, Because you're holding the only thing in the world that can prove a document here is genuine, even if that document no longer exists. All evening, the name Nadine Ostrovsky had existed in their minds as the name of a young woman who had been unfairly fired. Now it was an entirely different kind of name. Ruthie ended the call. She set the phone on the counter and stared at it, and she said softly, Dear God, that girl doesn't know anything. Josie said, Call her back. Ruthie said, Let her sleep when her shift is over. Sweetheart, we'll deal with it in the morning. And at that exact moment, the phone on the counter began to vibrate. Ruthie looked at the screen, then looked once around the room before answering, and everyone saw her hand slow down. She said, Hello. Nadine's voice on the other end sounded nothing like it had a moment ago. She said, Ruthie. She spoke softly, the kind of softly people used when they were trying not to let someone only a few steps away hear them. She said, I'm working at the motel out on the old road. I had barely hung up with you when a car pulled in. Ruthie said, A guest's car, sweetheart. Nadine said, No, they're not guests. She said 2 men just came into the lobby. They don't have a reservation, they didn't ask about rates, and they don't have any luggage. She said they came inside and they're just standing there. They're standing in the middle of the lobby and staring at me. Ruth Ann Doyle looked up. The entire room was watching her. At the table by the window, Rocco Vitale had somehow gotten to his feet without anyone noticing, and he was reaching for the coat hanging over the back of his chair. Gio Petrosino was already at the door. Nadine said, Ruthie, what am I supposed to do now? Rocco took the phone from Ruthie's hand and spoke into it, his voice slow and clear, like a man giving directions to a child. He said, Nadine, listen to me. Don't leave the counter. Don't go into the back room. Don't go outside for a cigarette. Don't go down to storage. Don't go anywhere. Stay exactly where there is glass, where there is light, where people passing on the road can look in and see you. Turn on every light in the lobby. If they ask you anything, answer normally. Don't argue. Don't ask them questions. Nadine said, Yes, sir. Rocco said, Keep the line open. Don't hang up. Then he handed the phone back to Josie and told her to keep talking to the girl. Say anything at all. Just don't let her be alone. Kowalczyk was already at the door, calling someone as she walked and giving them the name of the motel. Josie took the phone and said, I'm going. Rocco said no. She said, I know that road. I've been driving it through these winters, and you haven't. Ruthie had already pulled the keys to her truck from her apron pocket and put them into Josie's hand before anyone could say anything else. Outside, the snow was already ankle deep. Josie climbed into the truck, and Rocco got into the SUV with Gio, and the 2 vehicles pulled out of the lot less than half a minute apart, then split in opposite directions at the junction, because Josie took the old road along the hillside, while Gio stayed on the main highway. Inside the truck cab, Josie held the phone between her shoulder and her ear, and every few seconds Nadine's voice came through. She said they're still standing there. She said they aren't saying anything. She said one of them picked up the flyer on the counter, looked at it, then put it back down. Josie said, Just keep talking to me, sweetheart. Anything at all. Nadine said, I'm scared. Josie said, I know. She said, Keep looking through the glass. Look at the streetlights, and tell me how your mother used to make coffee. And Nadine told her, her voice trembling badly, told her that her mother always put in a pinch of salt. And Josie kept saying yes, yes, while gripping the steering wheel and sliding the truck through a curve she normally wouldn't have taken faster than 40 miles an hour. Inside the SUV, Rocco dialed a number. It rang. No one answered. He dialed again. It rang. Gio glanced over and asked, "Who are you calling, boss?" Rocco didn't answer. He dialed a third time, and this time he held the phone to his ear for a full minute until the call disconnected on its own. And Gio saw his face in the light from the dashboard and didn't ask again. At the motel, Nadine was halfway through a sentence when she suddenly went silent. Josie said Nadine. Nadine said they went outside. Josie said good. That's good, sweetheart. Nadine said no, Miss Calloway. She said they're outside, but they didn't get into their car. They're standing outside the glass doors. Josie could hear the girls breathing very close to the phone. Nadine said they're standing right on the other side of the glass, about 3 steps away from me. They aren't knocking. They aren't saying anything. They're just standing there looking in. Josie said, "Can you lock the door?" Nadine said it's automatic. I can't lock it from inside. Then she said, "Josie, I have to go into the back room. There's a deadbolt in there." Josie shouted inside the cab, shouted for the first time all evening, and said, "No, no, don't go into the back room. Nobody can see you in there." She said, "Stay in the light. Stay where there is glass." Then Nadine's voice broke apart, warped, and the phone gave one sound before going dead. Josie looked at the screen. There were no signal bars left. That stretch of road ran between 2 hillsides, and she knew very well that the signal always disappeared there. She'd driven through it more times than she could count, but never before had losing the signal meant anything at all. She put the phone down on the seat and pressed the accelerator. Ruthie's old truck roared and crawled forward through the snow. When Josie came out of the pass and saw the motel sign blinking in the distance, she didn't think about anything. She drove straight into the parking lot, didn't pull into a space, stopped right in the middle of the lane, and did 2 things at once. She pressed the horn and kept her hand on it. Then she ran into the lobby, walked straight past the 2 men standing outside the glass without looking at either one of them, went directly to the switch panel behind the counter where Nadine was crouched down, and turned everything on. She turned on the lobby lights, the hallway lights, the parking lot lights, the sign lights, even the floodlight pointed at the roof that probably hadn't been used in a year. The entire motel blazed to life in the middle of the storm like a football field. The horn was still screaming outside, long and unbroken, tearing through the silence of the old road, and doors began opening all along the hallway, people sticking their heads out, people stepping outside in coats they'd thrown on in a hurry, people asking one another what was happening. Josie stood in front of Nadine, blocking her from view, breathing hard, her hair wet with snow, and stared straight through the glass. The 2 men stood there beneath the blinding white light, with dozens of eyes now watching from the hallway, and they were no longer 2 silent shadows. They were only 2 men standing in a brightly lit parking lot with a great many people looking at them. One said something to the other. Then they both turned away, got into their car, and backed out of the lot. At the far corner of the parking area, inside a sedan parked nose first against a snowbank, a man had been sitting behind the wheel from beginning to end. He had seen everything. He didn't get out of the car. He was the only man in that parking lot tonight who didn't dare open his door. The state police reached the motel about 20 minutes later, and Kowalczyk stayed there, taking statements from the guests who were still standing out in the hallway, while Nadine was taken to a relative's house at the end of the street, with the plastic bin containing her mother's record books resting on the back seat. Josie drove Ruthie's truck back to the diner at close to 3 o'clock in the morning, and the SUV followed behind her the entire way. Only a few people were still inside. Brannigan sat at the counter with his coat draped over the chair beside him. Benny had turned off some of the dining room lights, and Ruthie was straightening chairs that didn't need straightening. Josie sat down on a counter stool and placed both hands flat on the wood, and for a long time she didn't say anything at all. Then someone knocked on the door. It wasn't the bell. The bell rang when someone pushed the door open, but this was the sound of knuckles against glass. 3 knocks, then a pause, then 2 more, the kind of knocking made by someone who wasn't sure whether she should be knocking at all. Benny said we're closed. Ruthie walked over and lifted the curtain on the door. Outside, beneath the light spilling down onto the front step, a woman stood, with snow gathered on the shoulders of her coat, both arms wrapped around a cardboard box held against her chest. Ruthie opened the door and said, "Ma'am, we're closed." The woman said, "I'm not here to eat." She said, "I'm looking for Josie Calloway." And Josie, sitting with her back to the door at the counter, went rigid. She didn't turn around. She sat perfectly still, and Rocco watched all the strength she'd built around herself over the past 5 hours leave her within a single breath. and she became again the same woman who had stood beside his table at 10:30 that night, hands trembling, face turned toward the window. She said softly, to no one in particular, "I know that voice." Then she stood and walked toward the door. The woman outside looked to be in her late 30s, thin, with a face that anyone in the diner needed only one glance to recognize as belonging to the same family as Josie's. She said Josie. She said it's Dory. Josie stood in the doorway with snow blowing across the threshold. And she didn't move. She said it's been a long time. Dory nodded. She said a very long time. Josie asked, "How did you find me?" Dory said someone recorded it. She said what happened in the diner tonight. Somebody standing in the corner recorded it and put it online, and I was at home scrolling through my phone, and I saw the name Josie Calloway, and then I saw your face. Her voice broke. She said you've grown so much. Then she held the cardboard box out in front of her, both hands trembling. She said, "These are yours." Josie looked at the box. It was filled with envelopes, standing upright, every one of them yellowed with age, and every front had a red postal stamp pressed across the address. Dory said, "I wrote to you every month." She said, "I wrote for years. I sent them to the address they gave me, and every month they came back, and the next month I sent another one, because I kept thinking maybe this time it would reach you." She said, "I never opened a single one. I left them exactly the way they were when they came back." Josie reached out and touched the edge of the box, then pulled her hand away. She said, "Why didn't you come?" She said, "Why, in all those years, didn't you ever come there yourself, even once?" Dory stood beneath the falling snow and said, "I tried." She said, "I was too young for anyone to believe me." Then she didn't say anything more about that. Josie looked out toward the parking lot, where Dory's car sat with the engine still running. She asked, "How many times have you sat outside this place?" Dory was silent for a long time. Then she said 4 times. She said, "Every time I sat in the car, and every time I thought she already believes I abandoned her. And if a person leaves, comes back, and then leaves again, that's even worse. So I drove home." Josie stood in that doorway for a very long time, and nobody in the room behind her dared breathe too loudly. Then she spoke. She said, "I'm not saying it's all right." She said, "I'm not saying I forgive you, because I don't know whether I can, and I've known you're still alive for less than 5 minutes." She said, "But I'm not going to leave you standing outside in the snow at 3 o'clock in the morning either." She stepped back and opened the door wider. She said, "Come inside. Sit down. Then you're going to tell me everything. All of it. And don't leave anything out." Dory stepped inside with the box held against her chest, and she stopped right there on the threshold, as though she wasn't sure the floor would hold her weight. Ruth Ann Doyle didn't say a single word. She walked behind the counter and switched on the coffee maker. And in the kitchen, Benny Salas cracked several eggs into a pan. Then a few minutes later, he carried out a hot plate and set it in front of the trembling woman. Because in his line of work, when someone cold and hungry sat down at your table at 3 o'clock in the morning, you didn't ask questions first. You fed them. Dory left close to 4 o'clock in the morning, after sitting at the corner table for nearly 2 hours and telling Josie everything Josie had asked her to tell. Ruthie drove her to the boarding house on Main Street. Benny shut down the kitchen and went home. Brannigan dozed off on a counter stool for a while, then woke up, put on his coat, and said he would be back when the diner opened. Gio went outside and sat in the car. That left only 2 people inside the diner, where almost all the lights had been turned off, except for the row above the counter and the glow from the parking lot filtering through the snow-covered windows. Josie walked over to the old jukebox in the corner, the one Addie had bought so long ago nobody could remember when, and that nobody turned on anymore, and she plugged it in. She said she used to play this while she cleaned up at night. An old song came through the speakers, faint and crackling, with the volume turned low. Josie came back and sat at the table by the window across from Rocco, and this time she sat with her back straight. She wasn't perched on the edge of the chair anymore. She said, "I owe money to the hospital." She said my husband's name was Danny. He was with the town's volunteer fire department, and he died several winters ago. And the night he left, I was sitting in the car, and there was something I wanted to tell him. She said I'd practiced saying that sentence for an entire week, sitting in the car, saying it over and over because I wanted to get it exactly right. I was going to wait until his birthday. It was only 3 days away. I never got to say it. She stopped. Rocco didn't ask anything. He didn't ask what the sentence had been. Josie took a sip of water and continued, changing the subject, and they both understood that she had closed that door. She said his mother is still alive. She's in the nursing home on the road into town. Her memory is gone now, most of it. I pay for that place every month, and that's why I count loose change. She said I visit her every Sunday. Then her voice softened. She said she doesn't remember who I am anymore. Every time I go, she holds my hand and says, "Thank you, nurse. You're so kind." She said I let her call me that. I don't correct her. If I correct her, she gets frightened. She said nobody is making me pay for her. People have told me to let the state take care of it, that I don't owe her anything. But I made Danny a promise, and he can't hear me anymore, so if I break it, nobody will ever know. She looked down at her hands. She said that's exactly why I have to keep it. Rocco sat quietly for a while. Then he said I can pay it. He said tonight, before morning, and you won't have to count anything ever again. Josie shook her head. She said no. Rocco said you don't have to prove anything to anyone. And Josie said it again, more firmly this time. She said I don't want to be rescued. She said I want back what belongs to me. She placed one hand on the craft paper envelope lying on the table between them. She said, "This belongs to me. Addie left it to me, and someone hid it. The money in that tin box belongs to me too. And to Ruthie. And to Benny. If you pay my debt tonight, then yes, I won't owe anything anymore. But I'll still be the person they spent 2 winters teaching to believe she wasn't worth anything." She said I have to go and take it back myself. Rocco nodded once and didn't say anything more about it. The song on the jukebox ended and another one began. Josie watched him for a long time. Then she said, "I want to ask you something." She said when you came in, you sat down in the chair on the other side. Then you stood up and moved over here. I saw you. I know why. Because I've been doing the same thing for 2 winters. Except you were afraid of what was outside the door, and I was afraid of what was inside the kitchen. She said, "What kind of man are you?" Rocco turned the cup on its saucer. He said, "You asked me directly, so I'll answer you directly." He said, "I've done a lot of bad things." He said, "I'm not going to tell you about them. Not because I'm afraid you'll think differently of me, but because you don't deserve to have those things living inside your head. You've already carried enough." He said, "I'm not sitting here trying to tell you I'm a good man. I know what I am." He looked through the window, where the snow had begun to fall more slowly. He said, "But tonight I walked into this diner and saw someone drowning in the middle of more than a dozen other people, and not one person moved." He said, "I know that sight very well. I spent my whole childhood watching it and being unable to do anything." He turned back toward her. He said, "So tonight, I did." The following afternoon, Rocco Vitale sat in a room behind an old laundromat in Springfield, across from a man past 60 named Sal Ferraro. No one invited him to sit. He sat anyway. Sal said, "You've come a long way, Rocco, and through a storm too." Rocco said, "You already know why I'm here." Sal said, "I've heard bits and pieces about something happening up in Vermont." Rocco placed an envelope on the table and pushed it across. He said, "Inside are the operating rights to the warehouses at the port, all of them. I'm not keeping any share." Sal didn't touch the envelope. He stared at it for a long time, then looked up. He said, "How many years did it take you to get those warehouses?" Rocco said, "Yes," Sal said, "and you're planning to trade all those years for what?" Rocco said, "A diner off exit 12 in Hollis Junction. The land beneath it, and everything standing on that land." Sal leaned back in his chair. He said, "Do you know how long you and I have managed to stay at peace with each other?" Rocco said, "I know." Sal said, "And now you're sitting here, sliding this across my table, because of a diner and some girl who pours coffee." Rocco said, "I'm not trading all those years for the diner." He said, "I'm trading them so I don't have to be the kind of man who leaves something like that alone." Sal Ferraro watched him for a very long time. Then he pulled the envelope toward himself with 2 fingers, and he said, "That place you mentioned, I've never heard of it." He said, "And starting today, I've still never heard of it." Then he added one more thing, and there was neither kindness nor mockery in his voice. He said, "Your mother would probably be proud. She was just as foolish as you are." On the drive back, the snow had stopped, and the sun was dropping quickly behind the bare trees. Gio was driving. After about half an hour, he spoke, and he sounded like a man who'd been rehearsing the sentence in his head all afternoon. He said, "Boss, I have to tell you something." Rocco looked out the window and said, "Go ahead." Gio said, "For the past several months I've been calling Mr. Ennio." He said, "I've been telling him where you go, who you meet, what you say." He said, "I call every week." The car traveled another half-mile in silence. Gio said, "I didn't sell you out. I swear before God I haven't taken a single dollar from anybody. He said more than 10 years ago, when he assigned me to you, he made me swear something. He told me if there ever came a day when the kid went soft, I had to tell him. Gio said I swore I would, and I kept that oath. Then he said, his voice gone rough, I know what this means now. Do what you have to do, boss. Rocco kept looking out the window. He stayed silent long enough for Gio to start counting his own breaths. Then he said, you kept your promise to my uncle. He said, I'm keeping a promise to a dead woman. He said, that makes us even. He said, drive, Gio. I'm tired. Gio Petrosino couldn't say another word for the next 20 miles, and at one point, he had to lift a hand and wipe his face. That evening, Rocco didn't wait for anyone to summon him. He went on his own, and he entered the room before the council had even finished taking their seats, and he placed on the table the position he'd held for 8 years. Ennio Vitale, his uncle, past 70, sat at the head of the table and said, Do you understand what you're doing? Rocco said, I do. Ennio said, people saw your face. The whole country saw your face inside a diner because of something that has nothing to do with us. Rocco said yes. Then he said something no one in that room had ever heard him say before. He said, do you remember my mother? Ennio went silent. Rocco said, my mother worked the night shift until she couldn't do it anymore. He said she died at 51, right there in that apartment. And until the very last day, she still believed the thing people had spent all those years teaching her to believe, that she wasn't worth anything. He said, I've made a great deal of money, Uncle. I've had everything a son like me could have brought home and placed on the table for his mother. He said, and none of it could buy back the one thing she needed, which was for somebody to look at her and see a human being. He said, the night before last, I walked into a diner and saw that exact thing happening again. He said I couldn't turn away. He pushed his chair back toward the table. He said, with your permission, Uncle. 4 days later, Josie Calloway sat down at the table by the window with a pen in her hand. Kowalczyk had brought the copy from Nadine's mother's notary record book to compare against the document, and every line matched exactly. Walt Brannigan sat across from her, and he'd driven in from Rutland early that morning just to be there. Ruthie stood behind Josie's chair. Benny came out of the kitchen, wiped his hands on his apron, then left them resting there. Josie picked up the pen and sat quietly for a long time, and everyone let her have that silence. Then she signed her name on the blank line Adelaide Pruitt had left waiting for her before she died, and she signed slowly, like someone writing a name she wasn't yet accustomed to owning. Brannigan signed beneath her. He set the pen down and said, 30% of this company belongs to you, Miss Calloway, and it has belonged to you since several winters ago. The paperwork only caught up with the truth today. Josie didn't say anything. She sat there looking at her name beneath Addie's. And Ruth Ann Doyle, standing behind her chair, suddenly spoke. She said, do you want to know why she wrote that letter? Josie looked up. Ruthie pulled out a chair and sat down, and she sat with the posture of someone about to tell a story she'd kept inside for far too long. She said Addie wasn't born the owner of this diner. She said when Addie was young, younger than you are now, she poured coffee in this very room. Benny turned around. Ruthie said back then the diner belonged to somebody else, and there was a manager. She said Addie told me about him exactly once, one winter night when the two of us were wiping glasses after closing, and when she finished, she made me promise never to bring it up again. She said that manager never raised his voice at her even once. She said that's the part I remember most, because when she told me, I didn't understand why that mattered, but these past few days I finally have. Josie sat perfectly still. Ruthie said she endured it for several winters. Then one night, a stranger passing through stopped in to eat. A man nobody knew, and whose name she never learned. She said he ate his meal, and when he stood up to leave, he stopped beside her and asked her one question. Ruthie paused. She said Addie told me there was nothing special about that question. Anybody could have asked it, but for years nobody had. She said Addie told me that night was the night she began to leave. She didn't leave right away. It took more than another year, but that was where it began. She said then Addie found work somewhere else. Then she saved her money, and decades later she came back and bought the very diner where she'd once cried in the back room. Nobody in the room spoke. Ruthie placed one hand over Josie's. She said, so listen to me when I tell you this. She said that letter wasn't written only for you, sweetheart. She wrote it for any girl who ever found herself standing where you're standing now. She just didn't know yet that your name would be Josie. Josie lifted both hands to her face and cried, and this time she cried out loud, holding nothing back. The kind of crying her body had spent 2 winters learning to swallow. Ruthie sat beside her and simply let her cry. The following week, The sign outside in the parking lot was taken down. The new one went up with the name Adelaide's. Josie had the handwritten letter framed and hung it on the wall beside the cash register, where anyone paying their bill would have to see it, and beneath it she had a small brass plaque, mounted with a single line engraved into it. Here, people are seen. Then she sat down with Brannigan and said, I'll accept, but I have 3 conditions. She said first, from now on nobody in this place touches another person's tips. No shared jar, no redistributing, no talk about making things fair. Whoever earns it keeps it. She said second, the door to the manager's office in the back stays open at all times. Even when I'm sitting in there, even when I'm doing the books, because the last 2 winters began with a closed door. Then she gave him the 3rd condition, and she said it more slowly than the first 2. She said no one who works here will ever be fired for speaking up about something. No one, even if what they're speaking up about is me. Brannigan sat quietly, then nodded. He said, Miss Calloway, I've been in this business a long time, and I've never heard anyone ask for 3 conditions like those before. He held out his hand. He said, and I've never met anyone who deserved all 3 more than you do. 1 winter later, Adelaide's was full at the hour when there had once been only a scattering of customers. Ruth Ann Doyle was the shift supervisor now, and she moved through the dining room with the bearing of a woman who no longer had to glance toward the kitchen door before doing anything. Nadine Ostrovsky had come back to work the afternoon shift, and she often told the new employees that here, whoever earned the tip kept it. Nobody touched anyone else's money, and the new people always asked her one more time just to make sure they'd heard correctly. Benny Salas had started singing in the kitchen again. Bernadette Kowalczyk's investigation stretched from spring into summer, and the real estate company was eventually forced out of that highway corridor, along with several of the names behind it, while Grant Mercer had to answer in court for what he'd done during those 2 winters at the diner. The last time Kowalczyk stopped by, she sat down at the table by the window, finished her coffee, then told Rocco Vitale, I spent years trying to prove you don't have a conscience, and now I have to write a report explaining why you do. She said, you've ruined an entire year of my life. Then she paid her bill and left. Dory Vance came to the diner every Thursday. She sat at the corner table, ordered something, ate, then stayed a while afterward, and some days the 2 sisters talked for an hour, while other days they exchanged only a few sentences. There were things that still hadn't healed, and both of them knew they hadn't healed, but what they had was real, and she came every week. And Josie had stopped flinching whenever the door opened on Thursday afternoons. Rocco Vitale no longer held any position in Providence. He moved to Burlington, about 40 minutes away by car, and he came to Adelaide's on Saturday mornings. He still sat at the table by the window, still chose the side facing the door. That habit couldn't be broken. Gio Petrosino still came with him, even though nobody paid him anymore. And when Josie asked why, he only shrugged and said, I'm used to it. That Saturday morning, the bell over the door rang, and a young man around 20 years old stopped in the doorway with a backpack over one shoulder. He looked around the crowded room, looked at the counter, looked at the framed letter hanging beside the register, and he stood there without coming farther inside, the way someone stood when he wasn't sure he was allowed to. Rocco didn't turn around. He only set down his coffee and said, that's him. Josie looked at him. He said, I met him a few weeks ago at a diner outside Albany. He washes dishes. The owner there is the same kind of man, and the whole room keeps its eyes down on the plates the same way. He said, I asked him one question. Then I told him about a diner in Vermont, and about a girl who once cried where nobody could hear her, and now her name is on the business. He said he didn't believe me. Nobody does the first time, so I gave him the address. Josie set the coffee pot down on the counter and walked across the dining room. She didn't hurry. She stopped in front of the young man and rested one hand lightly on his shoulder, exactly the way someone should have done for her a long time ago. She said, hello, sweetheart. Then she looked into his eyes and asked him the very question a stranger had once asked her on a snowy night, the question someone had asked Adelaide Pruitt before her, and perhaps before Adelaide, someone else had asked another person in another diner during another winter. No one remembered anymore. She asked, who made you cry? The young man stood there, and his eyes turned red, and he couldn't say anything yet. Josie said, that's all right. Come inside. Sit down first. Coffee is free. She said, you made it here. You've already done the hardest part. We'll figure out the rest afterward. This story leaves us with 3 very simple things. Real power doesn't lie in making other people afraid of you. It lies in making another human being know that they are seen. The greatest cruelty in this world often doesn't arrive with shouting. It comes in a very quiet voice repeated every single day, until it stops sounding like the voice of the person who said it and becomes your own voice inside your head. And finally, it only takes one person choosing not to look away for everything to begin, but the rest must always come from the person at the center of it, finding the strength to stand up for themselves. If tonight's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with someone you believe may need to hear this. How did you feel about Josie and Rocco's story? Have you ever met someone who asked you exactly the right question at exactly the moment you needed it most? Please leave a few words in the comments. We truly want to hear what you feel from the deepest place in your heart. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.